Welcome to this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today, I interview Melissa Arias, an Ecuadorian conservation biologist who has worked extensively on jaguar conservation. She is currently the coordinator of Jaguar and Priority Landscapes and the manager of the Regional Initiative on Anti-Corruption at the World Wildlife Fund. She did a PhD at the University of Oxford researching the illegal wildlife trade on jaguars in Latin America. On this episode, we talk about a lot of the work that Melissa has done for the conservation of the species and discuss in detail various threats faced by the jaguar and how the jaguar can be conserved better. Tune in to listen more, and don't forget to subscribe and share to this podcast if you enjoyed the episode. Welcome, Melissa. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast to talk about jaguars today.
Thank you so much, Anish. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So, what got you interested in studying and working on jaguar conservation?
Yeah, so it all started when I was doing my undergraduate studies in Ecuador. I was studying something entirely different. I was studying international relations. And then as part of my curriculum, I had to take a course outside of my normal course of study, and I took an ecology class, which took me into the Amazon, and I was able to be part of a project that used camera trapping to monitor biodiversity in a scientific station very deep in the Amazon. And that was the first time that I saw the camera trap images of jaguars, and I became completely obsessed. And I knew since then that I had to do something for their conservation. So that is what got me into jaguars. And since then, I started to change my career path, study ecology, and focus on big cats.
So, how are jaguars faring in terms of their conservation status? Where are they found, and what are the main threats they face?
Yeah, so jaguars are found throughout Latin America. They go from the south of the United States to the north of Argentina. So they have a very large continental range. And there's a big uncertainty when it comes to their population numbers. As I mentioned, their range is so large, and they are found all over in many different ecosystems, from tropical rainforests to savannas ecosystems. And so even though there's been a lot of efforts to monitor jaguars with camera traps, it is still very, very little what we know about this species overall, and there are big gaps in population numbers. And so the numbers, as I mentioned, vary a lot, but I think in general, what we know is that they are not faring very well. And this is because even though in some specific spaces we have seen some increases in the population, and there are even some interesting rewilding cases in some areas of the range, but mostly what we know is that jaguars have faced a significant contraction in their historic range. Nearly 50% of their range has already been lost, and there has been a 20% decline in their habitats over the past 14 years. And jaguars continue to face critical threats from habitat loss, especially you've probably heard about the news from the Amazon, where there's so much droughts at the moment because of climate change and deforestation, and really intense and frequent forest fires that are exerting very strong pressures over jaguar habitats. And on top of that, we also know that there's so many high incidences of jaguar conflict across the range, and this is a huge threat for the species. There's also an increase in the trade in jaguar body parts for both domestic and foreign markets. And in general, they are just affected by encroachment from human settlements and roads that are cutting through their habitats and decreasing connectivity. So overall, the scenario is not the best for jaguars, but we do have some interesting success stories in some parts of the range.
So, talk about the work you did on jaguars for your PhD.
Yeah, so for my PhD, I was able to focus on the human dimensions of jaguar conservation. And I did my field work both in Central America and Bolivia. And my field work included speaking with authorities and people from the conservation community, as well as with local communities that coexist with the species on the ground. And I was trying to investigate what is the prevalence and the drivers and characteristics of a new threat to jaguars, which was the illegal wildlife trade. And basically, when I started my PhD, we started to hear in the news that there were more and more seizures of jaguar teeth, especially coming from Bolivia. And these seizures were made while they were in transit to China. And so we only had that information that authorities were seizing these items, but we did not know what was the purpose behind the trade, who were the buyers, what were the market like. And so that's what really drove my PhD, to try to understand more so that we can learn how to react and how to address this threat. And so that's essentially what I did through many different methods and in these two study areas.
You have worked quite a bit to understand the patterns of the illegal wildlife trade of jaguars in Belize and Guatemala. So talk about some of your findings from this study.
Yeah, so in general, my study in both locations, in both in Bolivia and then in Central America, we're looking at some of the drivers behind the trade, and that included both commercial and non-commercial drivers. So as I mentioned before, there has been a lot of attention gone into the links between the jaguar trade and Chinese wildlife markets. But for my research, what I found is that in addition to that links to China, there's also a very active domestic markets for jaguar parts. And different jaguar parts, like the skins, the teeth, the fat, the meat even, have multiple uses in domestic markets, and they are associated with local traditional cultures of the local communities that coexist with jaguars. Their parts are used for different medicinal, cultural, and decorative purposes. And jaguars are killed because of conflict with domestic animals, but also because people fear them quite a lot. And so they kill jaguars whenever they have the chance, because of this fear that they may attack people. So whenever there's a chance encounter, that's an opportunity to kill jaguars and then to use the body parts that are traded. And then the body parts are used at local communities. They often stay in the same place where they were poached, or they are transferred to physical markets or even sold through the internet. So that was kind of an overarching pattern throughout my studies, but in particular, you asked on the work on Belize and Guatemala. And I think that the main difference is that while in Bolivia, there is this strong connection to both domestic and international markets. For the case of Central America, it's a trade that is much more domestic and more opportunistic. And so something interesting in this region in particular is that the trade has a link to tourism. So many of the seizures of jaguar parts have been made in areas that are frequently visited by tourists, like hotels, popular beaches, crafts markets. And so the tourists may not know that purchasing these items is illegal, and then they take them home and engage in international trade international illegal wildlife trade without even knowing. So that was something interesting that was happening there in Central America. But also the jaguars sometimes are kept alive as pets, or even as a touristic attraction in informal zoos or informal facilities that keep wildlife for tourism. In Central America, as you probably know, it's a region that is heavily affected by criminality, drug cartels, and many other social problems. And these issues also permeate into wildlife trade. And so some of the seizures in the region also had something to do with drugs trafficking or trafficking in weapons, because the jaguar parts were found together with these other illegal items. And so there were some similarities and differences between the two regions, but overall, what was interesting is that there's always this interplay between the foreign uses or the foreign interests and then the local domestic markets, and then this connection to local livelihoods, to human-jaguar conflict, and to cultural traditions in Latin America.
January 2021, you published a paper focusing on an evidence-based approach to tackle the illegal wildlife trade of jaguars in Latin America. So what was this paper about, and what were some key findings?
Sure. So as I was doing my research, I noticed, as I mentioned, that there was this big focus on jaguar trade in China. But in general, there was very little information connecting the two outside of Bolivia, especially. And there was a lot of issues with the evidence, the information. And in general, I think in the illegal wildlife trade, there's challenges around the evidence. It is very difficult to get information about the trade, and the information that you get is full of bias, because you may have seizure data, but then you don't know everything that was behind that seizure. And so I noticed that sometimes decision makers and the people who are working to address illegal wildlife trade are guided by their own preconceptions about their trade, by their previous experiences, by their emotions at times even. And then these preconceptions are what guide or inform their decisions rather than the evidence and the science. So through this paper, I investigated what are some of those biases. For the case of jaguars, it was very clear that whenever people heard that foreign actors were involved, or that the parts were being shipped to other countries for commercial purposes, this was very important to them, even though sometimes the domestic trade and cultural or traditional purposes behind the trade can even have bigger impacts on the population, because they can be happening at a larger scale. So I was looking at how the decision makers react to these differences in the information. And then I developed an approach to help decision makers and conservation practitioners to assess the relevance and the uncertainty of the evidence, to be able to recognize their own interpretation biases, and to consider more carefully the scale, the source, the space, and the time behind the evidence, so that they can really assess where the stronger impacts are and not let their judgment be clouded by preconceptions about the trade.
So what do you think needs to be done to further improve jaguar conservation?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question, and not an easy one. So I think more and more we are realizing how important it is to work more closely with the communities that are living next to jaguars, and that constantly have to face the risks and the challenges of that coexistence, especially working with them to change behaviors that lead to negative interactions with jaguars, especially when it comes to reducing conflict between jaguars and domestic animals, and when it comes to that fear of jaguar attacks. But it's also important to work with communities to be able to provide incentives and provide improvements to their livelihoods in a way that they really feel like it's beneficial, and that is able to change the way that they perceive living next to a big predator. So I think that work with communities is extremely fundamental. And to achieve that, I think that the funding for conservation really needs to reach the ground, and the communities have to be able to benefit directly from those resources. so that they can be incentivized to act in favor of conservation because they see a legitimate benefit behind it. And of course, this also involves bringing in younger generations of conservationists and scientists, specifically from these communities, because they really have the power to change the perceptions of their parents, of their families, and to bring the change that is needed over the long term. So I think investing in those local capacities is probably the best bet for the future of conservation and jaguars, because, as I mentioned, jaguar range is so large that I think we need to be very strategic in making sure that we are acting in these places where communities are being heavily affected by jaguar presence.
You also work as a coordinator of the Jaguar and Priority Landscape Project by WWF. So what was this project about?
Yes, so at WWF, we have a regional jaguar strategy, which is implemented by our offices all throughout the jaguar range from Mexico to Argentina. And this strategy includes 5 key pillars, which are securing the habitats of jaguars and ensuring that they are also connected, reducing killing of jaguars, either by focusing on human-jaguar conflict, but also the illegal trade in their body parts, and then catalyzing cooperation and building enabling conditions for jaguars, such as political will or effective communications or science. So my work includes supporting all Amazon offices, all WWF offices in the Amazon, to help deliver this strategy. So we try to address key gaps that may exist to do this, including funding gaps, geographical gaps, technical gaps, advocacy gaps, and so on. So I really try to make sure that all of our projects are delivering this strategy. I'm also part of different jaguar scientific efforts that are happening within our offices, and I represent our jaguar work in international spaces, such as the climate or the biodiversity COPs, where it is also important to make sure that authorities are paying more and more attention to threatened species like jaguars and the conservation of their habitats. And I also work to ensure that there is learning and experience exchanges between our different offices and between the projects that they execute, because each office has something to teach other offices, and there's so many new experiences that we are gaining and developing new innovative approaches. And so it is important for all the other people working on jaguars to learn from those lessons. And so I help to support those exchanges.
Throughout your career, what have been some of the most prominent challenges you have faced and some of the biggest lessons you have learned from conservation?
Yeah, so I think for me personally, one of the biggest challenges that I faced, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that I had to switch career paths when I was doing my undergrad, and then later on from a very different topic into conservation and ecology and biology. So that was a big challenge, to just learn a whole different set of theories and methods and statistics and a very different set of skills. So that was a challenge in and of itself. But I think beyond the academic aspects of it, I think it was a bit of a challenge also to find the niche in bringing interdisciplinary science into the conservation of jaguars and big cats in general. I think so far there has been a big focus on the biology aspects, on monitoring jaguars, and we're only starting to understand more of the human dimensions of conservation. And so I think it was first a challenge to bring in that different vision, that multidisciplinary perspective. But over time, I feel like there's more understanding that those elements are necessary and that there's space for them and that they are hugely important to achieve conservation. Of course, a challenge is always to get funding for studies and for projects. It is a very a field that in general doesn't have a lot of funding and it's very competitive. So I think that's a challenge that all conservationists face. But I think some of the most important lessons that I have gained as well is perhaps that we as conservationists, we love the species that we work with, and we would give anything to see them thrive and to conserve them. And because of this passion, we may oftentimes endure many hardships, and those hardships can be financial, physical, personal, mental, and so on. And in conservation, there's also many disappointments when we find that things do not go as planned or that things go wrong for the species that we care about because of climate change and because of the huge amount of threats that we are facing. We may also be discouraged when we feel like we are not having a direct impact on the conservation of the species that we love. But I think sometimes what we need, or the lesson that I have learned, is that we cannot ignore also conserving ourselves, not just the species that we love, but also ourselves, and trying to find a balance with our personal lives and our emotional health and so on. That is hugely important, and it's the only way that we can ensure that we will continue to have an impact in the environment and in the species conservation, is if we also conserve ourselves and give us the energy and the boost that we need.
And my final question for you is that what has been your most memorable moments from your conservation career so far?
Oh my goodness, I think for me, jaguars are just so difficult to find, and I have spent so many years searching for them. So I think whenever I find any signs of jaguar presence, even if it's just a footprint or a mark on a tree or anything, I think those are some of the best moments in my life. I always say that to me, jaguars are like a unicorn. They're a species that I think are mystical, are almost imaginary, because you never really get to see them. But I was able to fulfill my dream of seeing jaguars in the wild not so long ago when I visited the Panthera, which is an area in Brazil where there's jaguar tourism, and it's probably one of the few places where you can see jaguars almost certainly. And it was just completely incredible and amazing to be able to finally see that unicorn, or that mystical species that I have devoted my life to, and then to see them in person and thriving, interacting with each other. I think that was really the best part of the job.
So that was the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure learning about jaguars.
No, my pleasure. And yeah, I look forward to keeping in touch.